And you mentioned a good point too, is, childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It's the number one thing. I work mostly with 12 steppers, so like
Okay.
friends and family members of alcoholics, addicts of any nature, creed, just every background.
Right.
And that is always an aspect. We're always looking at their ACEs, we're always looking at their adverse childhood experiences. And so you're stating, and I agree with you, it's like if you're coming in the realm of therapy to work through something that's bringing you distress,
Yeah.
it's probably pretty fruitful to look for history of trauma.
Yeah. I'm not saying like all things stem from your early childhood and your issues with your mother. Like we don't have to Freudian it, but it definitely, our brain wires very young, right? Like we have 90% of our neurons by age 3. Okay. And then all the pruning happens in your teens as your brain starts to take shape and decide what's keeping, what is throwing away. And so if you're not looking at that, you're missing a very significant piece of the brain development everybody's experienced in very key years. And so if you experience something during those years, that's what came out of this ACEs study, is that individuals who experience high ACE scores, it literally changes your genetics and it changes your brain matter. And so it changes the way you cope with things at a very early age. And so, like for, addicts who start things in their teens, like it shapes how the brain copes with stuff. And so you have to kind of look at some of these things.
Yeah. And what are some of your just kind of go-tos when you're working with people when you start to notice that they need just straight up coping skills in whatever version of the work that you're in with them, whatever phase, knowing that this is just part of it? What are some of the like go-to coping skills that you really like as a clinician?
So I talk to all my clients about breathing, and anybody you have come in, they're like, oh, breathing. And I'm like, but it's legitimate. When you are struggling, when you are, especially, when we talk PTSD and that panic or anxiety starts to set in, you create your own biofeedback because shallow breathing starts, racing heart rate. And so if we can remember just to breathe, we can slow all that down and kind of take more control and feel less out of control in that moment. Grounding techniques are also one of my favorite things, recognizing the here and now, being present in the moment, which then brings you to mindfulness activities, to be more aware of yourself, because we kind of ignore ourselves a lot. And if you've experienced trauma and you've always had to maybe take care of a parent or take care of a sibling, we put ourselves on the back burner, and we're not it's like, oh yeah, my stomach hurts, but it's fine. It's like, stop, wait a minute. Let's backtrack that. Pain tells us something. So what's going on?
Yeah. We, my therapist always tells me, she says, everybody has to feel. And when we run from it, and I'm a dude, so I got real good at running from my emotions.
Yeah.
And, but we're always going to act it out. Sometimes people do it in really productive ways. Sometimes people do it in really destructive ways. But either way, we're acting out the emotion.
Yes. And so it's important to be aware of yourself, because in that awareness, you can recognize the triggers that are setting you off, because that's kind of where those maladaptive coping mechanisms started, is that you kept getting triggered by something and you didn't like the way it felt. And so we're leaning on things that aren't helpful to deal with it. And so, it's functional until it's not, right? That's kind of usually the DSM's diagnosis, is like, it's dysfunctional in daily life.
Yeah. And, and then the big one, which is, is this causing you a clinical level of distress or not? And, it could be causing some kind of distress, but if it's not that significant distress and you're coping with it just fine, then we look for other descriptors.
Other causes. Exactly. Yeah. So we were talking about like how childhood trauma kind of changes the genetic makeup and all of that. And, Kaiser Permanente, the study they did was on people with HMOs, so 40, 50-year-old men and women, doing kind of a retrospective interview. And these ACEs tell us that, it has true medical consequences in what we experience. And the research shows that, individuals who have an ACE score of 4 or more, are 12 times more likely to have an epigenetic marker. And so for those who don't know what epigenetic markers are.
For those who don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, so an epigenetic marker is essentially like the on-off switch for your gene. So think of it as like a light switch, right? And so what happens is that for individuals who are, predisposed to a genetic condition, so you're not going to have some random show up. I mean, it happens, but it's not as likely. But if you're predisposed to a genetic condition in your family, having an ACE score makes you at significantly increased risk of having this disorder. And so I'll never forget, I was teaching a parenting class, caring for the traumatized child, and I had a grandma who was taking care of her 2 grandchildren, who had been their mom had been taking care of them, but there were men in and out of the house, there were drugs involved, all of that. And she was saying, as I'm telling her this information, she goes, I may need to follow up with the doctor on her youngest grandchild, who was like 3. And I was like, really, why? And she was like, well, there's a kidney condition in the family. And he, was starting to show signs, but he's 3. And like the signs, I guess, don't usually come around to like they're 8 or 12 or older. And I was like, you might go back and talk to the doctor and really have a deeper discussion on what it, if it is this kidney disease that's causing the issue, to get treatment, potentially started earlier, because, I think whatever it was preventable, that kind of thing. Yeah. Of course, in the world of parent education, like they went on their way and I have no idea how that ended, but I hope for the best.
That's part of the tricky part of being a therapist is you impart the knowledge and the wisdom and you hope they do it. And unless you're doing long-term work, you don't really find out.
You don't always get the ending. Sometimes it's kind of like you terminate and they're good. And if you don't hear again, you're assuming things went well.
Yeah.